The Fallout series has spanned 28 years, 6.5 games, and now a television show. With the second season of said show just around the corner, it's a great time to quickly recap the main story events that have happened so far. The world of Fallout started very similar to our own. Nations were born, they fell. Wars raged on, but humanity persisted. Following the Second World War, things split between our reality and the universe inside the games. The exact point at which this occurred is not really clarified, and you'll get a different answer depending on who you ask. Personally, I choose to believe the pivotal moment was the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where humanity didn't look upon the splitting of the atom in horror as we do now, but instead with admiration. The director of the television show, Jonathan Nolan, describes the post-World War II America as that exceptional America, the Eisenhower-era America that never had Watergate, never had Vietnam, never had Woodstock, never had a conversation with itself about its own sins and transgressions, and just blustered forward to another American century. This blissful age did not last forever, as in 2051, a series of conflicts that'll later be known as the Resource Wars slowly began. Nuclear energy was just about everywhere, from the office building you worked at to the car you took to get there, but that put a strain on the world's uranium supply. This and petroleum became scarce and worth fighting over. Everything was kicked off by the United States incursion south into Mexico. Under the guise of stabilizing a failing state, the land of Uncle Sam was also able to secure that their southern neighbor's petroleum supply continued flowing north. The European Commonwealth, some sort of trade or defensive alliance between the European states, followed America's lead and waged war on the oil exporters in the Middle East, spurred on by the sharply rising prices of their goods. This was not as simple of a conflict as had been seen in North America, and the fighting raged on for almost a decade. It was not ended via peace or surrender, but instead the oil fields simply drying up, and everyone realizing there was nothing really left to fight over. The Euro-Middle Eastern War also featured some small-scale use of nuclear armaments, which led the United States government to start their own preparations for a wider-scale conflict and the potential end of the world. After some hashing out, it was decided that there would be a large number of underground bomb shelters, known as vaults, to be developed across the country. These vaults were going to preserve humanity and democracy if things ever went south, but some members in the government saw another use case for the large number of potential human test subjects in a controlled area, and thus, the Vault Tech Corporation was born. Europe was at war, but everything was not going much better across the pond, as America had started to fight an invisible threat, and an infection known as the New Plague. The disease was a death sentence, with some horrible symptoms such as swelling, external hemorrhaging, and according to the government, even socialist thoughts. It quickly turned into an epidemic, and in 2055, a company known as Wasteland started developing a potential cure. They titled the Pan-Immunity Viron. The Viron had mixed success with its original cause, but it did result in a large amount of muscle mass gained, and some other major benefits the military became quickly a fan of. Their research was shifted, and the cure was renamed to the Forced Evolutionary Virus. The United States' reprieve from armed conflict did not last forever, as in 2066, China launched an offensive into Alaska to try and secure some of the world's last remaining oil reserves. Although preparations had gone into securing the state ahead of time in fears of a potential war, it didn't seem to be enough, and the communist state quickly took ground. One of the largest problems that the US faced was a logistical one, as in order to supply the troops on the front line, they had to route their goods through Canada. It being a different nation was a nightmare, so America came to the brilliant conclusion of just annexing Canada. This did not really go over so well with the Canadian population, and riots and protests became commonplace. Unknown to the residents of the former Maple Leaf Nation, the US Army was about to roll out something that would make resistance pretty futile. Now, not all the residents of the United States were having as rough a time. As with many such conflicts, the makers of arms were seeing their pocketbooks swell. One such person was a Mr. Robert House. House was a brilliant mind and a savvy businessman who, through a series of hostile takeovers and power plays, brought his company Robco to dominance. Although his financials were firmly in the green, he saw the beginnings of a coming large-scale nuclear war and started to prep his residence in Las Vegas for the end of the world. As the Sino-American War raged on, he even voluntarily entered a stasis chamber to sleep through the impending collapse of society. Robco was still chugging along on their secret project they hoped would turn the tide of battle, However, they were beaten to the punch by a collection of other defense contractors, which were able to put the Chinese forces on the back foot. With the battle lines effectively stalemated, the US forces launched a surprise offensive into the Chinese mainland with the help of the newly created power armor. This mechanical suit greatly enhanced the capabilities of Earth's wearer and struck fear in the communist forces. This counteroffensive, combined with the power armor hitting the snowy fields of Alaska, broke the stalemate and allowed US forces to retake the land. In particular, the Battle of Anchorage entered the history books as a show of the unbroken American spirit and the power of democracy. There were even murmurs of a great beast spotted in the Alaskan wilderness that was developed by the United States and released to cause havoc. By 2077, the United States had successfully forced the Chinese forces out of Alaska and had fully turned their focus to the mainland incursion into China. A new model of power armor, titled the T-51B, only ramped up the United States' dominance. There was also a new variant titled the T-60, which was focused on squashing domestic conflicts and protests at home and in the newly annexed Canada. On October 23rd, 2077, the American forces had lodged themselves deep into the Chinese homeland, but their progress was slowing. As people started to display their Halloween decorations, it began to dawn on some that they hadn't really seen any high-ranking government officials in quite some time. That didn't really seem to bother a couple in the Boston area who were waking up with coffee and talks of a day in the park. A slightly upsetting door knocker signed them up for the nearby vault, thanks to their husband's former military service, but they weren't going to let some doomer bring down the mood with their infant son, Sean. On the other side of the country, a former A-list actor, Cooper Howard, was working a birthday party to keep him and his daughter afloat. Interest in his wife's work at Vault-Tec led to him running in with some communist sympathizers, which may have led to the downfall of his career. He was still able to enjoy the time he spent with his daughter, however, and as a great father should, he ventured into the party to get her a slice of cake. The events that follow are shrouded in mystery and heavily disputed. Some claim that China, on the brink of collapse, acted like a cornered dog and lashed out. Others believe that a shady group consisting of high-ranking US government officials saw the potential that a clean slate would provide. Talks between Vault-Tec and the leaders of some of the world's largest companies seem to indicate that Vault-Tec would be willing to take some drastic measures to ensure that their underground bastions would be actually utilized. All that is known is that someone pushed a big red button, and in the following couple hours, the world ended. The planet that had been fearing a nuclear holocaust had its concerns justified, as its residents scrambled for shelter. Those who had spots in the local vaults flocked to their new homes, believing they were the lucky ones. Little did they know the horrors that were in store for them. These vaults were far more than just a place to hide out, as many of them held a much deeper secret. A large majority of the vaults were actually social experiments, the horrors of which lead me to believe that they would have much rather faced the nuclear blast head-on. Some examples of such were a vault that forced its residents to elect a person to be sacrificed every year, a door that was created intentionally to not seal, leading to its residents becoming mutated creatures we would go on to call ghouls. Another was a vault filled with the most pretentious of elites, intentionally made too small and placed under the leadership of an unqualified anarchist. And yet another had no means of entertainment, but instead came stocked with a massive armory and enough guns to go around. That one actually turned out fine, so who knows. As with all good experiments, there was a large number of control vaults that would be used to set a baseline. One such vault resided in the hills of West Virginia and was numbered 76. 25 years following the end of the world, its residents were released with the goal of starting a whole new world from the ashes. This was not their only mission, as the overseer of the vault had also been tasked to secure the nuclear missile silos in the surrounding region for Vault-Tec, as well as for an organization known as the Enclave. They were aided by some of the residents of the vault, who also managed to tackle a new infection that had taken over the region, known as the Scorched Plague. They would also come across a ghoulified bounty hunter, who seemed to look a lot like that actor they had seen steal the silver screen before the Hollywood Hills went up in flame. They met many other factions along their journey, including a group calling themselves the Brotherhood of Steel, which was composed of what remained of the United States Armed Forces. Home base was on the other side of the country, where Vault 8 resided. A couple decades after these events, on the West Coast, a former resident of said vault set out to discover the source of an increasingly large number of mutated beasts that were wreaking havoc on Southern California. Richard Gray, along with some companions, eventually found the source of the monsters in an old military base nearby. While exploring the site, Gray was knocked into a vat of what appeared to be green acid, and it was assumed that he had met his end. This was not the case, as he had actually fallen into a variant of FEV, the pre-war project of West Tech. Over time, his mind became greatly enhanced, and he harnessed the virus to gain powers such as telepathic communication with computers and others infected with FEV. He would go on to become obsessed with connecting the entire nation together, as he believed it would result in the highest form of empathy and solve all the world's problems. He would title this new hive mind the Unity, with the minor downside being that he would have to infect its inhabitants with FEV. This noble goal was too great to let minor concerns like consent get in the way, so many were converted by force. Once turned, a person would probably die, but if they managed to survive, they would grow into a green beast known as a super mutant. The Master was eventually able to amass an army of these monstrosities, and their numbers continued to grow day by day. In another part of the southwestern United States, Vault 13 had suffered a catastrophic emergency as their water purification ship had broken and they were unable to reliably produce the life-sustaining liquid. Although it seemed like an unfortunate complication, the chip was actually designed to break as part of Vault Tech's sick and twisted experiments. The Vault tasked one of his residents to scour the waste for a solution, who, after much tomfoolery, was able to find a suitable replacement. Along the journey, however, they'd become aptly aware of the Master and its army and sought to bring an end to their reign of terror. What exactly occurred in the military base is up to players' discretion, but we knew know for sure that when the Vault Dweller emerged, the Master was no more. His army of super mutants still persisted, however, now leaderless, many became pacified and attempted to rejoin society. Speaking of rejoining, when the Vault Dweller returned home victorious to Vault 13, they were not brought in with open arms, but instead turned away, as they had become contaminated by the outside world. They wandered the Wasteland for a time before eventually founding the village of Arroyo, where their descendants would go on to shape the world in a similar way that they once did. Before such change could occur, a small settlement that the Vault Dweller had stopped by would shift the balance of power in ways that had never been seen since the bombs fell. Shady Sands grew in influence and eventually rebranded as the New California Republic and adopted a democratic system of government. This started to bring stability to the Wasteland, and the NCR would eventually grow to encompass large swaths of the southwestern United States. This stability was not appreciated by a group of individuals hiding off the coast of California. Before nuclear fire engulfed the Earth, a secret cabal was forming within the high-ranking members of the government. This group was the Enclave, and prior to the end of the world, they managed to hide out in a series of highly sophisticated locales. One such place was under a resort in West Virginia, but another was at an oil rig in the Pacific. It was here they were able to continue much of the research that was underway before the Great War and developed a new and improved set of power armor and refined FEV. They managed to aerosolize this new variant and were planning to spread it across the United States to wipe the slate clean of those pesky holdouts so that they could start the world fresh. This plan would eventually be thwarted by a descendant of the Vault Dweller that had once saved the Wasteland. This chosen one, as they would come to be known, was tasked with finding the Gek. Standing for the Garden of Eden creation kit, it could save their village, which was teetering on the brink of collapse. Their mission eventually resulted in them destroying the Enclave oil rig and scattering the remnants across the irradiated nation. One of these remaining factions traveled east and set up in what remains of the nation's capital. While they were getting situated, a child was being raised in the nearby Vault 101. This vault was special in that it was never to be opened, in order to test something I don't really know. They had actually opened the doors before, though, to let in said child and their father for his skills as a doctor. The dad had ambitions past the walls of the vault, and one night he broke out and escaped back into the capital Wasteland, chased by his kin, who, now grown up, would come to be known as the Lone Wanderer. The two would reunite and briefly continue work on the dad's life mission, an effort known as Project Purity. The goal was to utilize the Jefferson Memorial to create a water purification plant to clean the Potomac, and bring clean water once again to the area. Their work was quickly interrupted, however, by the Enclave, who commandeered the memorial, and it was only through an act of sacrifice by the Lone Wanderer's father that they did not take power over its functionality. For you see, the Enclave wanted to utilize Project Purity to poison the Witters and kill off the surrounding residents. They kind of got like one thing. It was with the support of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Lone Wanderer was eventually able to retake the memorial. The Brotherhood had an ace up their sleeve in Rob Coe's secret pre-war project, a massive nuclear football-throwing spreader of freedom known as Liberty Prime. With the Jefferson Memorial retaken, they were able to activate Project Purity and complete their father's dream to bring some relief to the wastes. At some point along their journey, they'd come across a person identifying themselves as a representative from a group known as the Institute, who was hunting down a humanoid robot indistinguishable from any lay person that may be walking down the street. This is important, and we'll get back to it. But first, we have to travel west, where a new force is rising in power. A group of men, including ones known as Edward Sallow and Joshua Graham, were sent to the Grand Canyon by their higher-ups to study the tribes that currently inhabited it. The residents of the canyon were not so inviting, and the men were captured by the Blackfoot tribe. The tribe was locked into a war with many of the surrounding peoples, and they were not doing so hot. Sallow, however, was a very well-educated man and able to take control of the situation. Through his academic knowledge of warfare, he led the Blackfoots to victory and control over the 7 tribes that once stood as their rivals. They continued to expand and subjugate those they conquered, forming a massive empire. Sallow, having a deep understanding of ancient history, decided to follow the blueprint laid out by another great empire, that of Rome. He was to be called Caesar, and his empire, Caesar's Legion. Expanding west, they came upon Hoover Dam, and with it, the NCR that held it. Viewing it as his Rubicon, Caesar launched an assault on the dam, which, although initially appearing victorious, was revealed to be a trap, and the Legion suffered a massive defeat. For his failure as a military leader, Caesar covered Joshua Graham in pitch and lit him on fire before casting him into the Grand Canyon, where he surely died. The NCR had remained in control of the dam and could see to its west the shimmering lights of the New Vegas Strip. Mr. House had successfully predicted the end of the world, and through his advanced missile system he had built in the region, was able to keep Las Vegas relatively unscathed. After the dust settled and some time passed, Mr. House reawoke and rebuilt the Strip with some of the local tribes. He had his sights set on an upgrade for his security force that was in transit when nuclear war broke out. Being disguised as a simple gambling instrument, he hired the Mojave Express to bring him the platinum chip. But there was a minor hiccup in transit.
Time to cash out.
Will you get it over with?
Maybe cons kill people without looking them in the face. But I ain't a fink. Dig? You've made your last delivery, kid. Sorry you got twisted up in this scene. From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
The courier that had been shot in the head outside of Goodsprings somehow survived and managed to make a full recovery. Being the good mailmen they were, they hunted down the platinum chip and the man who had attempted to end their life, eventually finding them in Caesar's camp. Here is where things get interesting. The following actions are left up to the player. There is to be another great battle over the ownership of Hoover Dam, and the person holding the controller is able to shift the scales and lead one side to victory. There are options being Caesar's Legion, the NCR, Mr. House, or they can play the wild card and take the reins themselves. Whoever is able to hold the dam at the end of the day will wield immense power over the region for years to come, but we currently don't know who came out on top. Traveling back to the East Coast, we come across a familiar family, frozen in cryogenic chambers inside of Vault 111. Another twisted Vault-Tec experiment froze the couple under false pretenses, one still holding their son in their arms. The other was forced to watch as, after being thawed out, their son was kidnapped, and their partner was murdered. They were put back on ice for an indeterminate amount of time, awaking with rage, and quickly starting on their journey to hunt down their son, and the killers who took him. Donning the title of sole survivor, they took on the Boston area, and found it was in less than a stable state. The Institute, being composed of what remains of the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, had effectively perfected their formula for lifelike robots, called synths. Paranoia took over the region as nobody could be sure if their neighbor bled the same blood as them, or even if their sibling had been replaced. The sole survivor discovered the Institute was responsible for the kidnapping of their child and forced their way into the faction's underground bunker. It was here they met with their son, who was all grown up and running the place. It had been a far longer gap than they had thought since they awoke for the first time. It is at this point, yet again, where our path diverges. The Commonwealth is at a tipping point, as 4 major factions vie for power and control. The first is the Institute, led by your son. You can help squash the other forces under his feet and get his newly improved nuclear reactor functional. You could instead join the Brotherhood that we have become very familiar with throughout the series. The Brotherhood destroys the Institute and leads the Boston area into the future. In a more direct opposition to the Institute is the Railroad, which seeks the freedom of the near-human synths that the forces under the ruins of CIT are turning out. With your help, the Railroad can destroy the Institute, and through a series of spies and general espionage can exert their power over the Commonwealth. Finally, you can side with the Minutemen, whose main focus is the return to stability, which will also involve them destroying the Institute. We do not have a clear picture who the victor of this regional conflict was, but an airship that looks eerily familiar to the Brotherhood's residence in Boston is seen a couple years later on the West Coast. This airship brings an order to the Brotherhood faction out west to seek out a former Enclave scientist, for a reason that is not known to the grunts tasked with catching him. One of these foot soldiers is a squire named Maximus, who commandeers his nice power armor after the man meets an unfortunate fate. Maximus takes his search to the small town of Philly, where he comes across a former vault resident, Lucy McLean. Lucy is on a journey of her own, as she's looking for her father, who's been kidnapped by a gang of raiders after they snuck into her home vault. A familiar face also makes an appearance in Philly and wreaks havoc. The ghoul we had seen in the hills of Appalachia is hunting a new bounty. The same individual who Maximus was looking for, and luckily for everyone present, or unluckily, that scientist just so happens to also be in Philly, and a gunfight ensues over his head. He escapes with Lucy, and it turns out what everyone's looking for is literally his head. Near death, he instructs Lucy to decapitate him and bring the prize to the observatory outside of LA. A faction is suspiciously missing, however, as there's no trace of the New California Republic in the lands they used to rule. It is uncovered that Lucy's dad had a much darker past than even she was aware of. Hank McLean was a pre-war employee of Vault-Tec, who was frozen in time and thawed out to run the operations of Vault 33 as its overseer. He had left the vault briefly, where he detonated a nuke in Shady Sands, crippling the NCR. One of his pre-war coworkers was the wife of a man we would go on to know as the Ghoul. There's an enclave of the NCR hiding out at the observatory Lucy's heading towards. When she gets there, she's met by her father in a cage and informed of his true past. The head she's been carrying all along contained the last key component in a cold fusion reactor that can power all of what remains of LA. She guilts her father into revealing the code required to get it up and running when the Brotherhood of Steel attacks. Another large-scale battle ensues as the Brotherhood faces off against the NCR, and the Ghoul is there too. The cold fusion generator is kicked off, but Hank McLean escapes east, with Lucy and the Ghoul hot on his tail. Maximus is falsely given credit for ending the conflict and touted as a hero, and we are left with the final shots of Hank overlooking the skyline of New Vegas, where our story is due to continue. The world of Fallout is as deep as it is wide, so I was not able to give every story the time it deserves. However, I hope this was able to serve as a recap with those familiar, and a suitable introduction for those looking to hop in now. Regardless, good luck out there in the Wastelands, and remember that war never changes.